All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 119 of the PetroNerds podcast. I am Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds, the host of the PetroNerds podcast, and this is your election special. So this is a special drop. We just had a drop episode 118 with Paul Tice, but I am joined here with my guest, and we're going to do something cool today. We're going to do a fliparoo with this sort of hosting. But my guest is Jason Issac, the head of the American Energy Institute. I've had him on before. I'm an economist with American Energy Institute. But Jason, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Trisha, great to be on. Thanks for having me. Look forward to having a good discussion with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So this one, we're going to do this. I'm going to timestamp this. I'm going to give this little intro, and then I'm going to turn this over to Jason, and he is going to sort of host this or interrogate me, ask me questions. We have a goal here, and this is really to have some fun, but this is also to sort of get ahead of this because I have, I followed the stock market very, very closely, and I'm getting my information from sort of Bloomberg and CNBC, and also Wall Street Journal, and and Financial Times. And I want to dispel. There's a lot of things going on in the election that I don't think are really well covered right now. So we want to dispel some of that. But I'm going to timestamp this first and then give a little bit of a run of show, which knowing Jason, we'll hit some of that. Maybe we won't hit all of it. He's going to add more into it, but we're going to cover the election and we're going to cover energy, particularly within the election. So it is Wednesday, October 30th. We have only a few days till the election. October 30th, 2024. We have WTI. And I mean, really critical that, gosh, the Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have gotten so lucky with low oil prices. But we have WTI sitting at 68.87. We have Brent at 72.81. I think that's really telling. That's telling us we're headlong into recession, at least globally. We have Henry Hub at $2.82, which is it's creeping up. And Dutch TTF, this is European natural gas prices. Really, really important to point out, folks, because European natural gas prices are almost $14. They are 13 bucks and 70 cents, almost 71 cents. So pushing 14 bucks an MCF, that is pretty high, folks. And that's just really important to realize if they have a harsh winter, what it's going to look like in Europe. And then the 30-year mortgage, I just can't help but harping on this one because the 30-year mortgage right now is above 7%. And I want to remind listeners that the Fed cut interest rates half a basis point, and it did not a damn thing because one, they went too aggressively, and two, the bond market has just pushed things back up. So we have the 10-year yield at 4.284%. And that's the reason I say that. And I know that's nerdy, folks, but it is important to talk about this because I have never seen stock market coverage of an election like this, where they say, well, Harris is, going to be bad for, she's going to be bad for the deficit, but Trump's going to be worse. And it's like, well, okay, let's really talk about that. And they don't know because we haven't had this. And also, we did have a former Trump presidency. We haven't had a Harris presidency, but we have had a Biden presidency, and we know how much they've spent. And Biden spent a lot more than Trump. So, anyways, that's one of the dispelling myths. But I want to talk about, so the goal of this podcast is to dispel some of the bias, just dispelling some of the bias, getting to the meat of the energy issues. Jason is a former politician. He's very passionate. We know where he stands, and I like that. And the point of the American Energy Institute is really to be unapologetically pro-domestic oil, natural gas, and coal. And I think that's important to point out because there's so many entities that are not for domestic oil and gas production. So it's important to have an entity that actually talks about it and is for the production of domestic fuels. So we want to get to the meat of the issues, though, with energy issues on Harris versus Trump, and to think a little bit about the outcomes and what it actually means, and not, oh my gosh, we're all going to burn and die if Harris is elected, or oh my gosh, Trump is a fascist and we're all going to die because he's Hitler. I think that's what we're hearing, the extreme narratives that we're hearing on TV. And I say that, folks, because I'm hearing that on the stock market. I'm not watching Fox. I'm not watching CNN, and that is what I'm hearing on stock market coverage. So the big things, the run of show, I think I just did this BBC News interview, and Jason listened to it, so he he knows what it was about. It definitely had my blood boiling. But they asked, that they basically, the premise of the interview was that there wasn't a lot of energy talk within the election, and I disagreed. The energy wasn't a big part of the election, but I want to talk about that, and within that, talking about energy and inflation and how big a deal that is. Some of the comments that JD Vance has made, really talking about energy. Trump talks about drill baby drill and frack frack frack, and he talks quite a bit about energy. Talks a lot about energy in the Joe Rogan interview. But I think getting into actual costs and electricity prices and electricity and natural gas and the role of coal and some of the deeper nuances that will be impacted by this election are super important. And I think the big third thing in there is talking about China and Iran and some of the foreign policy aspects of energy and how important it is to really talk about energy security, but also what is the role of China and we're talking about energy and why this matters so much. And Iran, there's big foreign policy implications here. I don't think Harris is going to be able to handle it at all because I don't think she understands energy nor foreign policy. But that has pretty big implications for manufacturing and energy costs within the U.S. And that is something JD Vance has talked quite a bit about. Um, I think talking secondly about Harris flip flopping or the Harris team on fracking, it's incredible to talk about because there's not much commentary, and that is almost telling in and of itself. But there's a lot of flip flopping on fracking. She's clarified in a CNN interview that or CNN the town hall where she said she's not going to ban fracking leases. I think we need to send her a little note that we don't have fracking leases. Jason and I will get into that. And then lastly, I think it's really talking about US energy production and energy prices. Some question I'm getting from clients is, yes, they're overwhelmingly the energy industry understands that, Trump is going to be a pro energy, pro economy president, less regulation. However, he talks about lowering energy prices. And I think there are folks within the industry that want to understand what that means. And I think this is where it really gets back into talking about it and electricity prices and how we need to get the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, and coal savvy about the role, and Cole knows this, but savvy about the role of gas in the electricity sector. So those are my big things. Jason, I know you there's a lot of that you like, maybe some you want to hone in on. But with that, I'm turning the hosting over to you and look forward to this. So have at it.
Thanks, Trisha. Appreciate it very much. Again, yeah, I guess some of your listeners and watchers may not know who I am. Again, I'm Jason Issac. I'm the founder and CEO of the American Energy Institute. I was served 4 terms, as you mentioned. I'm a recovering politician. I served 4 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. I call it my 8-year sentence, representing about 200,000 people just west and south of Austin, out in the Hill Country. And before that, I was a sales guy. I worked in the trucking industry. I marketed technology, drivetrain components, safety systems, fuel to trucking companies that bring us the goods that we depend on our daily lives. And everything that we're going to wear, eat today, live in at some point in time has been in or on a truck. And I'm gracious and grateful for the trucking industry and the energy industry that's powered that. When I was in the legislature, I studied and focused on energy and environment because I think that's an issue where conservatives, free market conservatives, don't do a good job of messaging when it comes to talking about our energy production and our environmental leadership. And I think both of those go hand in hand. It's interesting now because I represent a trade organization that supports unequivocally and unapologetically free markets. We support American energy, primarily oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, as you alluded to earlier. And those are pretty important. Those are things that can survive without subsidies. And earlier this week, I was at a luncheon promoting our work, and someone asked me, how would you differentiate yourself from other trade organizations? And I said, well, really there's a few biggest differentiators where we transcend the oil, gas, coal, nuclear. There's not really many trade organizations out there that do that. You can't buy your way onto our board, so it's not for sale. I don't care what your revenue is or your production is, but if you support free markets and you want to support our work, please do. And then lastly is I actually advocate for policies that would reduce the cost of energy. And there aren't many multinational companies out there that go out there and say, gosh, we should reduce the cost of a barrel of oil. But the people that support me and our work want lower cost energy because they understand the benefit to mankind and human flourishing. And those are pretty important things. And the person that I explained this to is kind of like, bang, wow. But I'll tell you, one of our board members quotes Winston Churchill, and Churchill said, "An appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodiles, hoping they'll be the last ones eaten." And that's what I saw when I was doing research on trade organizations around the country. They're feeding the crocodiles, hoping they'll be the last ones eaten. They're appeasing to climate alarmist agendas. And I like to say at the American Energy Institute, we don't feed the crocodiles, we wear them. But that's a famous British person. So speaking of British people, I was listening to you on BBC, and I was really hoping I could watch it because I am a studier of body language, and you obviously communicate more through body language than you do verbally. And I love to watch and really watch and listen to people and how they're communicating. And unfortunately, I had to listen to this one. But it reminded me of days when I was in politics. It reminded me recently of President Trump when he was doing a debate that he's really debating the candidate and the 2 hosts. And I was like, wait a second, Trisha's debating like 3 people. Like it seems like everyone's against her. And my adrenaline started going, and I was like, this is my sports. And I was just getting fired up listening to it. And you know, high praise, you just crushed it. And I know I was texting you when I was listening to it, and I was just like, yes, it's like flexing. And I was getting jacked up because it was just so awesome. But tell us about that and your experience doing that, and how it was getting teamed up against by three people.
Well, so firstly, I say I said it was contentious, and that when I put out the post, I said it was contentious, and my blood was absolutely boiling because I was called and they asked me to come on the show, which is great. The fact that so firstly, let's just point out that BBC, if you want to know about a terrorist attack or you want to know what's going on in the world geopolitically, BBC is a great place to go. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have a little biases on that, but if you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, you want to go that's your place. If you want to know about oil and gas or climate, is not the place because it is heavily biased, and you will hear that within the podcast. So when I was called and asked to like come on the show, I was pumped to be on the BBC because I listen to the BBC and watch them. And so they asked me, hey, talking about the election. And so the questions I was asked in the interview to get on the show were a little bit different. And then I was kind of blown away by the being asked a question and immediately being interrupted. And the way the questions were framed. And so it was, and even I think the one at the end was talking about, the role of solar and wind, how they're going to save the world. And I thought, I mean, I had to disagree with everything. And I think it's a great, like the response has been really, really good. The feedback has been phenomenal. And even folks, I heard some folks within the UK email back and say, hey, we need to hear this stuff, which is great. And we do, but I think it's so important that we realize that we do have a very biased media when it comes to energy. So I think but we talked about in that conversation, some things I didn't get to talk more about was that, natural gas is a bridge fuel. Like it's not a bridge fuel. It is a fuel. It's your destination fuel. It's going to be with you forever. And I think that's where we have to realize that so many people that are talking about energy actually don't know about it. It's really difficult. You know this with American Energy Institute. You've hired me as an economist, and I'm working with Common Sense Institute. I'm working with a ton of different organizations. I do a lot of work in and outside oil and gas industry for the oil and gas industry. And I can tell you, electricity is one of the hardest things to get people's arms wrapped around of why are electricity prices soaring. And so I tried within the interview to hit on the biggest things, the role of natural gas, the fact that wind and solar were not going to change, they weren't the fuels of the future, and they weren't energy secure. And also I think that the role of the tailwinds and headwinds, I think it's really, really important to realize that, they said in that interview that climate has not been a focus of this election. And I would agree that, for the Harris campaign, there's a really good opinion article from the Wall Street Journal that says, quote, Harris stops talking about climate change. And I would agree that the Democratic Party is not really talking about climate. And the reason is, and I said that in BBC, is that it's not sexy right now. And the climate conversation is not sexy when you have inflation. And so Biden talked all about climate. He said he wouldn't ban fracking, and then he went all out against the oil and gas industry. And that was another big thing we need to talk about. Everything you hear in the news of, yes, they say we're producing record oil production, but we didn't ban fracking, and so we're pro industry, but we're not pro industry, and there's a lot of confusion there. But so they're not talking. The Harris team is not talking as much about climate change, and so that's basically, so you have all the people in the media saying, "Oh, that's proof. She's going toward the middle. She's not going to ban fracking, and all you energy people, you need to stop this. That's ridiculous." And it's so important to me that within, Biden was elected. From the media, he was portrayed as a moderate. Did not lead as a moderate at all, and quite frankly, I mean, the video that you saw of Joe Biden talking about the garbage supporters of Trump supporters, one, he sounds completely senile, and two, the fact that that came out, like he was allowed to call, the fact that that just not destroy the Democratic Party, calling half of this country garbage, is, it's so sad. And if Trump had called all the supporters of Kamala Harris garbage, I'm pretty sure the world would just lose it. And so the fact that we have, them calling Trump Hitler, and then we have, Joe Biden, our president of the United States, calling every Trump supporter garbage, we're in a pretty bad place. But it gets
I
to this
can't
point of
keep up
talk.
with the nicknames that I've been given by this administration. I'm like, I'm ultra MAGA, Neanderthal, garbage. It's like I'm running out of places on my X profile to list all these names that I've been called. That, Carbon King is one of them. That was when I testified in front of Congress and I said I live a high carbon lifestyle. And I think the rest of the world should too. And Jamie Raskin, the congressman from Maryland, about lost his head and referred to me as a carbon king. And now I have it printed on my business cards, my wallet, my
Yep.
license
Yeah,
plate.
and you
I've
own it.
embraced
And
it.
you
I do. I own
and
it.
you own it. So, but I think a lot of this, so, a lot of it lost we get all political, and I think that's the intent, obviously, of the Harris campaign, is to lose, right, is to lose the content, right? So you just focus on, demonizing everything. And it's really important to think about how Trump's been demonized, but the oil and gas industry has been heavily demonized. And so I tried to bring that up in the BBC thing. I don't know if it came through, but the demonization of the oil and gas industry is really serious. When the president of the United States is writing letters to the oil and gas industry and saying, you're price gouging, we're not seeing letters from the president to the CEO of Excel saying he's price gouging. And what we're seeing on electricity, like, we have unfair, biased demonization of the oil and gas industry. And so we do have this 13.2 million barrels a day of record oil production. And, it so frustrates me that the announcers at BBC and everywhere on TV say, oh, well, you're pro energy and that's horrible. And that's, you're enabling climate change. But this industry is been pro oil and gas, and you're criticize the administration, but they've been pro oil and gas. And no, they haven't been. We're producing 13.2 million barrels of oil because we're drilling longer laterals. We have less rigs, and we've had high oil prices. We only recently have pulled back on oil prices, and that is really because we have a global recession happening, because we have serious weakness in China, because we have massive weakness in Germany, and because Germany is stupidly doubling down on China, just the way they doubled down on Russia. They haven't learned the lessons from history. You'd think World War II taught them something. It clearly has not. And, we've just had series after series of Germany making these constant mistakes, but that's for another podcast. But we have global economic weakness, which is really weighing on oil prices. That's saving, Joe Biden and team and Harris campaign, because they were going to sell off the Strategic Petroleum Reserve again to lower prices before this election, and they haven't had to do that. But high oil prices were really what enabled production. So we have this production growth in the U.S., and it's not. I mean, it's not on federal land. So something Harris, though, where she's flip flopped, and I wish the BBC would have asked about that, about fracking leases and things like that, is that the flip flopping on fracking is so serious, because I think you and I have talked about, like, what is actual fracking, and I talked
Well,
about
yeah, I
this
think
with.
that's a good point because she's flip-flopping, and I was so excited. I did an interview, oh gosh, I can't remember who it was with, so I'm not gonna say any names and try to guess, but that was, like, the first question in the interview is, "Jason, can you tell us what is fracking?" And I was like, "Oh, thank you," because I know that if you ask Kamala this, she couldn't answer. I just so that's the question to you. Trisha, this is like a good 30, 45-second clip we can probably pull out of this and regurgitate and use later to help educate the climate alarmists out there, but tell us, what is fracking?
Yeah, well, fracking is not, when she said she's gonna not ban fracking, that is not the same as hurting the ability to get a permit to actually drill. So drilling is what she's talking about. Fracking is what happens after. So yeah, no one's gonna ban fracking. They're just gonna prevent you from getting a drilling permit so you can't frack. Fracking is when you're pumping largely water and largely sand at really high pressures down to usually 10,000 feet, sometimes deeper, in that reservoir that's going to produce oil. You're cracking that rock and you're getting this oil out. And when I say that unpreviously thought extractable rock, it's basically, look at this table, look at this counter behind me, not the wood, but look at the actual table. Look at your granite on your countertop. I don't have granite countertops, but if you're fancy enough to have one, look at that and think about, could I squeeze oil from that? That's basically what we're talking with shale. And so when we're fracking, even what the wells that were vertically drilled, they were fracked. They were vertically drilled. There was a single frack. Now we just frack along a 10,000 foot. Think about 2 mile long lateral, 3 mile long lateral, not now 4 mile long lateral. That's really, really important, because I think that no one talks about the deep nerdiness of oil and gas when we talk about energy in the election. But really, 13.2 million barrels a day, that's because we're drilling 3 to 4 mile long laterals with less rigs. We're drilling less wells. And the reason you're doing that is because it's so damn hard to get a permit, especially in federal land. So the Biden administration did ban all permits on all federal land day one. They even revoked them on the first day they were in office for 60 days. Then the leases, we've had one lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico, record lease sale, because everyone knew they were never going to have another one. They only had the one because the court ruled against them and said it was illegal. Now it's been all kind of tied up, and they should have had more legally. They're legally bound to have federal lease sales. They haven't. And so when we think about what is a Harris administration going to do to the oil and gas industry, it will be a continuation of this one, in terms of, you're not going to, and it will be much worse, but you're not going to have federal lease sales. And right now, the ability to just re-up a permit. So if you have a permit that's expiring, to drill on an oil and gas lease, so you pay for the lease, you pay for the lease, then you have to still get a permit. So they're increasing the royalties, they're increasing all the fees, but once you've bought the lease, you are not guaranteed to drill on that land. So it's not about fracking, folks. It's about drilling. And in Colorado, we've had bans that didn't make it, but bans on drilling in 2030. Well, they've already inhibited the ability to do a lot without banning, so-called banning fracking. They have setbacks, all kinds of things. So I think it's absolutely ridiculous that the industry has not been more vocal about this. It's not a, and then in the CNN town hall, she called it a fracking lease. We've done more fracking leases. One, just honey, that is not what it is. It
Yeah.
is just absolutely, it's not a fracking lease. It's a drilling permit. And the lease is what you buy. You know, you do the lease and then you get the permit. And so their ability to strangle the ability to get permits on federal land, they've already done that. And so when you have a permit that is expiring under this administration, you can't get that. You can't renew that permit. And so then you have all the people on the far left on climate side say, well, you have all those permits. Why don't you drill them? Well, that's just not how the oil and gas industry works. I got all those because I have them. And then I learn more about my rock and whatever, depending on what oil prices are and what's viable, I'm going to drill that first. And so, that's why you just haven't seen, when we think about the Gulf of Mexico, it's phenomenal rock deep in the Gulf of Mexico. Mike Wirth was just on CNBC, had a really great interview on a rig with Jim Cramer and talking about this. And I think we've really seen some folks stand up in the industry like Mike Wirth. I think he was a little bit cautious in the beginning with this administration, and then they just saw so much pushback. They got the letters, and they're just now just saying, "Hey, screw it. You didn't help us then. You're not helping us now. We drill for oil and gas. We do it well, and we do a lot of it, and you need it." And so that's what's not being. BBC didn't say, "Hey, so what about the 100 million barrels a day that we consume? How important is that?" No one talks about that. They just say that the future is wind and solar. So I think the fact that it hasn't been talked a lot in this election cycle is it's important to point out because it means that they're not talking about it. Doesn't mean they're not going to that a Harris administration wouldn't be really really detrimental and more detrimental than a Biden administration. So
Well,
sorry, that's
and
a
you talked about a
long-winded
lot of the
answer.
leases on federal land. Well, and yeah, the leases on the federal land, I have talked to people that play in that game and buy those leases, and they're offering up like a patchwork quilt of leases that's
Yep.
nowhere near the infrastructure. Like, hey, we're going to give you this lease way out in the middle of nowhere that just happens to be hundreds of miles away from any of the gathering infrastructure. So you're not going to be able to get that oil or natural gas to market. But we're selling leases or we're making leases available. And that's detrimental to the federal budget. You produce oil and gas on federal lands and it goes into fund our parks. And that was something that was flourishing during the previous Trump administration. And I hope happens again during another administration. Now, I know some mechanical engineers, and I've talked to them and asked them, have we figured out a way? I know we figured out a way to harness waves and wind to a certain extent. I said, have we figured out a way to harness flip flopping? And they like, no, that we haven't figured that one out yet, Jason. I'm like, well, dang it, if we could figure out how to harness flip flopping from Kamala and smug from Germans, we would have an unlimited supply of electricity. But because she's flip flopped, I think like one of the headlines I read, I think it used the word reverse 3 times, like reversal of the previous reversal of her policy on fracking. And I'm like, is this a triple negative? How do you read this headline? But I think she's gone back and forth 4 times on her flip flopping on fracking, which I know we just talked a little bit about. But there are some signals that sends to the market. Like if she's elected president and people think that she's going to ban fracking, the market's not going to make investment decisions on like next week or on next month. They're looking out pretty significant amount of time, years for their investment to get some returns. So how does this flip flopping and her let's say she is elected president next week? Um, Hopefully that's in an alternate universe that I'm not a part of. But what does that do to energy prices, here in the United States? Are we going to continue to see what we've seen over the last 3 years?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think this is where listeners can get some value from this because I think we should be looking out. I'll probably be running for office if Kamala gets elected. I'm probably I'm not going to take this machine and take this down, but or take this line
I
down. But
support
I
that.
think the implications are pretty big in terms of so it's what's going to happen to Congress. So if you're following this and I'm listening to like Bloomberg surveillance, which has done a pretty good job, they even note when they're biased, like the guy Tom Keene is on and he's like when he's biased, like he gets kickback from people on YouTube telling him he's biased. And he even says it. He's like, "Oh, people are mad at me for being hard with this guy." And I just Bloomberg surveillance in the morning, they do a really good job of getting all this content. They have different people on there and they've been talking about, when Trump was at when he did McDonald's and how that was a good move and all kinds of stuff. I think CNBC has actually honestly been a little bit more biased, and that's why I'm listening to like Squawk Box in the morning and stuff. So, but the market coverage has been, some of the things I'm hearing in this is the election contention. So, if it's contested, right? If we have a contested election just within the White House, that's one thing. But whether or not we know, so, there's a few outcomes. Personally, I think it's either going to be a knife edge or razor edge, or it's going to be a blowout, one way or the other. And, if we have a clear answer, that's one thing for the presidency. But the problem is really it's Congress. So you hear everything. When I'm listening to all this stuff, I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm hearing everything that, it could be super tight in the Senate, or it could be super tight in the House. Could you flip it? Could you not flip it? People are thinking that the Republicans might lose the House, but then they get the Senate. So then you have if you have a Harris administration, you have a split Congress, or if you have a Trump administration, you have a split Congress. The outcome's a lot different. It means that, any whoever's in the White House, if they have a split Congress, they can't pass everything. Now, if they have a split Congress and they're the tie vote, then they can, right? That's what we saw. We saw this when Harris is the tie vote and you're doing that. So it's Tim Walz. We know, I think that's really important to clarify here. The voting record of Harris prior to being the vice president, where she did absolutely nothing, was extremely far left. And I say this because it's so important. Like she was for the Federal Reserve taking on climate change. Like, I mean, she was as far left as they get for politicians. Now she's saying she's a centrist. Now she's a gun owner. Like, this is amazing. Like, you are seeing all these Democrats. There is a like they're becoming like MAGA. And I heard this on, there's such a really good Wall Street Journal video that just showed this, of how the left, how the Democrats are running and actually embracing, like, I voted pro Trump on this and I voted with Trump on this, and these are Democrats. And this is hilarious to me. But this is what's happening. So I think if we think about a Harris administration, if it's a blue sweep, when that would be amazing. I just don't see that with the economy right now. But if it's a blue sweep, very, very damning, because that means that then we have, and I think this is where the market is incredibly wrong. If it's a blue sweep, the stock market has gotten it wrong, because they're saying that, the stock market is banking on a Trump winning and higher federal deficits. That's really interesting to me, because I think we definitely have seen higher federal deficits under Biden. And if it's a blue sweep, you're going to have more government spending. And I say this in more handouts, and I know people don't like that term, but we got to clarify inflation. And something that JD Vance tries to get into, but he needs to get deeper. And hopefully today on Joe Rogan, he does that, is that when you spend money, like when you just write checks as a government, when we have stimulus package, when we have TARP, when we have things like that, they weren't quite as inflationary because they were one and done. When you spend on entitlement programs and they're sticky, that's when you get inflation. And so what we've seen under the Biden administration and the Congress spending like drunken sailors with trillions here and trillions there is sticky spending, right? It's very hard to pull it back. And so it really does matter who's in the White House and who's in Congress to see how much spending we have and how much repealing we do of something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which the BBC did ask about. And it's just this massive pork spending bill with everything in it. And I encourage you to go on the White House website. It's interesting because they have pulled out a little more off the White House website of the Biden Harris stuff. But if you go on the White House website and you look at the Inflation Reduction Act and you look at the actual spending, it is so much spending for every minority group, for farming and everything. I mean, they're just the list goes on and on and on of what the types of spending is. And you hear that, hey, we haven't spent it all, but then you start seeing the ballooning of the spending. It's in the trillions of dollars now, multiple trillions, $4 trillion. That's talked about, I think, in the Bjorn Lomborg article that he talks about in the op-ed piece with the Wall Street Journal, of how this is really cascaded out of control. So I think that we have a big implications for Inflation Reduction Act if we have a Trump administration and a Trump or a red Congress. We will have we'll be repealing stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act for sure. So this is where I disagree with the market in saying that Trump is going to be inherently inflationary, because I think that you know Elon Musk and team and everyone has been very clear, we want to cut spending. And so and I say this very honestly because I've spent so much time this year. I've met a lot of CEOs and people across the industry. But if you really ask people in this country, CEOs, what's the biggest thing impacting their business, they don't talk politics. They just say regulation. Like, one of the single biggest ticket items is regulation, is so much regulation, inability to build a building, the inability to build more housing. All this is regulation. And so something you hear when people talk about chips and like Intel got money from the chips thing. Well, they haven't spent it. All these companies that got money from the government, like chips and Intel just cut 10,000, 15,000 employees. And it's because the burdens that they have attached to building those chip facilities are so high. And so they can't comply with these regulations because they're so costly. And I think that's just a really big lesson. And this is what I'm talking about, folks, of sticky inflation. So if you want to know, yeah, I don't think the line items that people are doing on Harris are appreciating that when you add on this regulation, you don't put a number to that, these costs get incurred, lawyers and all kinds of things. So that's where we're going to have serious inflation under Harris, and then Trump. Well, who knows? But that split Congress matters a lot for repealing of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then I think really in terms of the headwinds and tailwinds, and that's something I tried to talk about in the BBC interview, is that when Biden got elected, you had a lot of tailwinds, and we still, to a degree, that they've faded out in the last year or so. But the big tailwinds on clean energy, right? Everybody's going crazy on carbon sequestration, tax credits, and carbon sequestration, and carbon this and carbon that. And we're just going to build wind and we're going to build solar. And if we say that, it's going to be good for our business. And I think in the first couple of years within the stock market, you saw that. Now that's fading out because these things are not making money. But and I don't know, you're not going to have a boon to that too much, because I think that the stock market and people are appreciating that these aren't making money. Harris will certainly provide more tailwinds to that. There'll be more of a push. And so if there's more government spending, which is going to be inflationary, that pushes toward that, some of those things might do well. But what you will see is that if Harris loses, if Trump wins, you are, regardless of Congress, you're pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, and you are going to stem the bleeding on oil and gas. So you will get a bump up in oil and gas production, I think, in stocks. And I'm not advocating stocks to buy, this is not a financial advocacy podcast, but I think you will get a bump in the performance. And that's important because, as I tell listeners, the stock market tells you a lot. Like, you have to read earnings calls, you have to know that about the market. And so, oil companies and gas companies publicly traded are not being properly evaluated. Like, they're not properly evaluated on their multiples for the value of oil in the long-term system, oil and gas in the long-term system, our global economy. So that's meaningful. I think that changes a little bit. And then the ability just to build infrastructure, I think, is, even if you have a split Congress, the ability just to give a breather to the industry, to say, we're gonna repeal the permit ban on LNG exports. So that will help. That will enable more LNG permits to get done, but also just more LNG deals, right? More long-term contracts signed with LNG suppliers in the U.S. with Europe. So all these little things that people think don't matter a lot, they're hugely beneficial. Saying you're going to help on Keystone XL, just finishing that, like, all these provide some headwinds. Really materially, though, and I'm sure you're going to ask and we get into, is what does it mean for oil prices and what does it mean for natural gas prices? And those are huge. Those are two
Yep.
things I think we should talk about along with electricity. But do you, anything I should clarify? Sorry, that was long-winded
No,
answer
no,
as
no,
well.
that's great. Yeah, because you're well, let me go back, because you look at her record, and I was looking for a screenshot that I had captured one day that just showed, as a San Francisco DA, she prioritized electric school buses. That's like the pinned tweet that I have with me and Jesse Waters talking about electric school buses, heavily subsidized. Just an absolute waste of money when we have propane school buses in Texas running at 50 cents a gallon equivalent for fuel. You talk about saving money for school districts, run on fuel that's made here in this country, like propane or natural gas.
I
She
love
opposed
propane.
drilling on public lands. I mean, 50 cents a gallon equivalent for a school district. You want to talk about saving money? Bang. That's how you do it. That's what we need more of. She opposed drilling on public lands. She defended California's push to require less polluting cars. I mean, this was as San Francisco DA. And then as Attorney General, she actually sued the Obama administration over allowing fracking off the Pacific coast. You look at the Pacific coast hundreds of years ago, that oil and the tar would wash up on the
Yeah,
shore, and the Native Americans that lived there would use that to seal their canoes. I mean, and now producing that is keeping it from seeping into the ocean. This is a good thing. Oil and gas production has been an incredible benefit for the environment when you think about it from those standpoints. She endorsed California's cap and trade program. All of these policies, as a senator, she sponsored the Green New Deal. She, as a vice president, cast the lone deciding vote on the so-called Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, that, as you mentioned, will dump trillions of more dollars into this. And as Senator Kennedy, he questioned a guy from the DOE. He says, what if we do? What if we spend all of this $50 trillion? What's the benefit? What's the benefit on climate? And the guy wouldn't answer him. And Senator Kennedy's like, you don't know, do you? You don't know, do you? Well, and this is this whole cult like fascination with decarbonization that was coming through in your BBC interview, that continues to come through and being pushed and kind of capitulated from other larger multinational corporations embracing net zero. I'm sitting there screaming at the screen when I'm watching this Kennedy interview, because I'm like, I know the answer, because I've actually run the models that the UN uses. They use a thing called the Model for the Assessment of Greenhouse Gas Induced Climate Change. And if you spell all that out, it's called MAGIC. This is their model. And if the US decarbonizes by 2050, if we reach net zero, the temperature differential by 2100, according to this UN model, It's less than 1/10 of 1
Yep,
degree.
that's the
It's
one that's the Bjorn Lomborg.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
puts
yeah,
that in his
Bjorn,
tweet,
it's
which he cites
interesting
in the
because
article. Yep,
yeah, and
yep.
the first time I met Bjorn was over at, University of Texas, which, interestingly enough, just launched a climate change major, which I'm just like, "Oh my gosh, is that because you need to subsidize your psychology major so that they can then treat these people that have eco dysphoria? You're trying to figure out your own, climate crazy economy there." But the first time I met Bjorn, we were talking. He's like, "It'd be great if there was some way that you could, do a TV show where people go and they live at net zero." And I'm like, "Well, it's happening. I mean, you just look at Ethiopia and you look at places in Africa, and today women will spend 200 million hours walking to collect water because they don't have access to energy. I think that's inhumane. We can solve that problem easily with American energy." But I told Bjorn, I was like, "Well, the shows already exist." And he looks at me and he's like, "What? There's like a climate show out there?" And I'm like, "It's called Naked and Afraid." And he just like, "Oh my gosh." And I'm like, "Those people are living in net zero. That's the low carbon
I mean,
lifestyle."
I think it's just the I think it's the developing world, and actually, it's kind of case in point to the fact that, and something I tried to also point out on BBC is that we don't count emissions. Like Europe is not counting the emissions when they burn trash, when they burn biomass, which so when they burn wood, which does release carbon emissions, or when they burn trash, they don't count the emissions for that. So the idea that we're getting actual real emissions, that's fictitious. And it just comes back to this bigger thing where it's the emphasis, right? The whole premise of that conversation was that oil and gas is evil, we have to reduce no matter what, and that wind and solar is going to save you, even though this wind and solar comes from China. And then they asked about that, and that was so incredibly frustrating because I was interrupted. But I think you remember that your blood was probably boiling too.
Yeah.
But she's asking about this wind and solar in China and how that China is going green, and that is just something in terms of the myths dispelling, in terms of the bias dispelling. So Trump is not Hitler. We can make that clear because we know what Hitler was like, and he wrote Mein Kampf, and he actually wrote a second book, and he told you exactly what he was going to do, and then he did it. And China is not going green. So like China's not going green. This is not happening. They have 5,700 terawatt hours of coal-fired power generation, and they have basically the same amount of green energy in their grid as we do, of wind and solar, so-called green energy of wind and solar. The fact that we have as much as they do almost, and we don't have the other 5,000 terawatt hours of coal, is a massive problem because China's making things. And I do want to spend a little time talking about that before we close the podcast. But I think that's like a myth dispelling, is that, the US we have to go green, and the West has to go green, and that China is advancing. We haven't heard any of this. Like, the other thing we're not hearing this election cycle is about China. And China is such a critical role, and that partly why, I'm working with you and working with folks on energy is the role of China. But I think we have to have some factual, honest conversations just about energy and a level set, to say where we're at, and that we're probably not going to, even if we can talk about CO2 all day long. But I think something you pulled out from one of my podcasts that I did in Gillette at the power plant after going to the coal mine was that, people asking me, I had questions asking me about this, and then about energy and what to do in CO2 emissions. And I'm like, if you think we're actually going to have climate change or we're raising CO2 emissions, then you wouldn't be putting wind and solar into the grid. And this is what I was trying to tell BBC, is these are really poor forms of energy that aren't efficient, and they don't work well in extreme temperatures. Especially a battery operated vehicle just doesn't work well in hot temperatures or cold temperatures, and loses that range and loses that efficiency and that capacity. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And you are starting to hear people who really think seriously about this. The fact that the demonization of oil and gas has actually hurt the ability for these folks who actually want to transition, because they know they need oil and gas. And so that's like an amazing realization. So I think that's where we just have to be honest. And I say this about the media bias because, again, I'm talking about the stock market, and the fact that the stock market isn't covering it is a big problem to me, because it means that people just aren't understanding, the actual implications of this, especially for what elections implications are for, say, oil and gas stocks, and for infrastructure development and the like.
Yeah, and I like to talk about, when people talk about the energy transition, and I'm like, "Oh, are you talking about transitioning the world's poor out of poverty into a prosperous life where they can have economic prosperity and environmental leadership by getting access to hydrocarbons? Or are you talking about transitioning all of our production over to China? Is that your energy transition?" Of course, that's not what they're thinking when they think about energy transition. But I want to play this clip real quick of JD Vance, right about a minute and 3 seconds, but it's of him talking during the debate that he had with Governor Tim Walz. So let me play this clip real quick.
Important for us, first of all, to say Donald Trump and I support clean air, clean water. We want the environment to be cleaner and safer. But one of the things that I've noticed some of our Democratic friends talking a lot about is a concern about carbon emissions, this idea that carbon emissions drives all of the climate change. Well, let's just say that's true, just for the sake of argument, so we're not arguing about weird science. Let's just say that's true. Well, if you believe that, what would you want to do? The answer is that you'd want to reshore as much American manufacturing as possible, and you'd want to produce as much energy as possible in the United States of America because we're the cleanest economy in the entire world. What have Kamala Harris's policies actually led to? More energy production in China, more manufacturing overseas, more doing business in some of the dirtiest parts of the entire world. And when I say that, I mean the amount of carbon emissions they're doing per unit of economic output. So if we actually care about getting cleaner air and cleaner water, the best thing to do is to double down and invest in American workers and the American people. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris has done exactly the opposite.
Well, I love that clip. And he starts out and he talks about clean air and clean water. And I like to talk to people and tell them that here in the United States, we're world leaders in clean air. We've reduced harmful pollution, things that in certain concentrations can impact human health. We've reduced that 80%, nearly 80% over the last 5 decades. I conducted some research that after the COVID lockdowns, you took nearly 40 to 50% of the vehicles off of the road after the COVID lockdowns for the first 2 months. And the air quality in some cities like Austin, Texas got worse. Places like Detroit got worse. We're at a natural state when it comes to air quality. We're world leaders. We are crushing Europe, which is so far, I guess, ahead of us, even though I think it's behind when you talk about the energy transition and decarbonization. He talks about clean water. We're number one when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water in the world. We are tied with a few other countries, but we're still number one. I think those are good. And I love the fact that he talked about weird science. But Senator Vance doesn't work on this like I do every single day. I don't live in, I live and breathe this. He doesn't necessarily, so he doesn't necessarily understand the messaging. But it kind of irks me sometimes when people talk about dirty and CO2, and I'm like, what color is it? What's it taste like? What's it smell like? You're talking about trace gas in the atmosphere that makes up 0.04% of our atmosphere that's necessary for life on Earth. And I had the opportunity to work with the Trump administration last time. I hope that opportunity presents itself again. But I was pitching this idea for a Pittsburgh Accord because remember when he got elected in 2016 and he said he was going to pull out of the Paris Accord because he represents the people of Pittsburgh, not the people of Paris. I thought that was great. Let's have a Pittsburgh Accord that just maybe calls on our trading partners to meet clean air standards. The World Health Organization has actually increased the burden of the standards because we met them. We were one of the only OECD countries that actually met them, the only one over 50 million people. They actually made them more stringent so that they could say that America doesn't meet clean and safe health air standards, which couldn't be further from the truth. We do. But I hope to get to pitch this idea again. Like we need a Pittsburgh Accord, a global air quality accord, because 3.8 million people will die from air pollution, from indoor air pollution this year, according to the UNICEF. And I think that's bad. But what JD Vance, Senator Vance is talking about is he's talking about we should reshore those manufacturing jobs. And you and I published a piece that talked about the emergence of China as an energy exporter. Talk a little bit about that because they're buying, billions of dollars of oil from people that aren't necessarily our friends that are funding bad things that are happening around the world. You mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Yeah. So, firstly, I will say that I really do love that clip with JD Vance because I listened to that debate as well, and I think he was extremely well spoken and eloquent. And it was there wasn't a question of who won that debate. It was pretty sad when Walz was stumped by his whether or not he was in Tiananmen Square during the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it
I think
was
I
clear
would
he
remember
wasn't.
that.
And so there's been a lot of things like, and that we're actually hearing a lot of stuff of pushback on Tim Walz that he was just not a good candidate to pick and that Shapiro should have been it. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. But I thought JD Vance did an exceptional job, especially with that comment. And we're hopefully going to have an op-ed out soon or article out soon where we're commenting on this stuff that JD Vance closed that debate by saying that, talking about energy and bringing this home. And so the first thing is that NOx and SOx. You're right. For NOx and SOx emissions, we lead the world. Like we have the highest air quality standards in the world, bar none. And I've been saying this for years when I go around the world. When people are referencing it was like 2017, I was in London, and the IEA, the chief economist with the International Energy Administration, the Paris IEA, was talking about Colorado CO2 or Colorado emission standards and how they were the most stringent. when the IEA is saying Colorado's is the most stringent, you're too far. Like you've gone too far. So we have some of the highest, like that was 2017. That was before we had all the setback, all the stuff that they happened under the Pulse administration in Colorado that limited permits. We already have some of the highest emission standards. So the problem is it's not about that, right? It's we have NOx and SOx. And by the way, NOx and SOx, you can't have the highest NOx and SOx air emission standards and CO2. They actually don't compute. That's why we had the Volkswagen scandal with the blue dye and all that stuff, because you have diesel cars in Europe. Well, diesel cars are not as clean for the environment. So cars, we don't have the penetration of diesel cars. We have diesel trucks, but we don't have the penetration of diesel cars because that's CO2 and that's about MPG. So the Volkswagen scandal had to deal with miles per gallon and MPG and the testing and everything. And that was what basically part of it was, the fact that you don't have the same standards in Europe for NOx and SOx, and they overemphasize and push CO2 and miles per gallon over nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide. That was what was happening there. So we have those standards, and I have the benefit of knowing this because I worked so much on the refining industry when I first came out of grad school and was working at a nonprofit in DC and working on refining. I mean, we have the largest, most sophisticated refining sector in the world, and something you always hear about refining is that how hard it's been for them, right? They've reduced their
Yeah,
their parts
those
per
are some of the
million.
regulations you talk about. We just
Oh,
shift production overseas. We increase the regulations here in the United States, and we just wind up shifting production. And it's not like you're shifting demand.
no,
Yeah,
exactly. You're not shifting demand. So, and it's amazing because we've held on. I mean, California's got rid of a lot of their refining capacity, and they're just going down a horrible path. California might as well be Europe or Germany in this situation, because they're getting rid of their refining sector. I know during COVID, we lost a lot of refining capacity, and then you had the Biden administration getting mad at the oil and gas industry. Well, it was California who dropped a lot of refining capacity, got rid of it, and then when we come out of COVID, everybody wants fuel, they want gasoline, and they want diesel, and we can't refine all of it. So we have a dislocation in prices. And so that's a reality. And so you have to refine this crude oil. And I think that makes so much sense when we talk about, like, if you know oil and gas, you know that you can produce it, but then you have to refine it. And we are a very special country because we produce more oil and gas than anybody in the entire world, with the highest standards, with the highest rule of law, with clean air. And we say that because you can go outside, you can breathe. Yeah, in Denver, I smell the Purina flat plant more than I smell anything else, but like you can breathe, and you can't say that about China. You can't say that about other places. And so that's just a really, really critical thing. And so in terms of air quality, in terms of water quality and everything, I think that both Trump and Vance have been very, very clear on that. Being an environmentalist does not mean that you are like, they are pro environment. It doesn't mean that they are pro going crazy on CO2 emissions, which is clear that they're not. So that's one thing. So but if you think about refining and you think about China, and we think about, like, the China piece is very, very big. And so when JD Vance is talking about bringing manufacturing home, and he does talk about slave labor, and I make it clear that, like, you can't build a $10,000 electric vehicle in China without the help of very, very cheap coal, which you further subsidize, and cheap labor, which most of that is, a lot of that has to be forced. And there's evidence to this. There's a great article, sorry, not article, a really, really good study and paper done by Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, that it's called Drive Force. It's great. And if you've just read that and you haven't done all the work I've done on China in the province of Xinjiang and all that studying, you probably wouldn't understand that China's done so much to actually move a lot of manufacturing, a lot of refining and processing of these when you make a battery, you have to refine the cobalt, the nickel, the magnesium, like all the graphite, all the rare earth metals you have to refine and process. Refining and processing takes a lot of heat. That's where the coal comes in, and it's very dirty. You have to pull out your uranium and thorium. Those are things that people don't want to do in the Western developed world. We're not going to refine we got to pull out uranium and thorium. China does that because they don't have the environmental standards. And even if they did, they don't have to play by the rules. So they just blow them out of the water. Why do you think this is done in the province of Xinjiang, where no one can see it? Why do you think they put incentives to where all these companies move up there? So, I listen to the earnings of Ford, and I hear, I see people coming out, and you're hearing Volkswagen just get smashed. Like, they can't compete against this. So I say this really seriously. It does really matter. Like, I shouldn't have, I want to clarify my shredding of Germany. I don't like the thing that Merkel has done, or Olaf Scholz, but Germany has been our ally. They're a bulwark of Europe. They are a manufacturing center of the world. And the fact that they're hurting and declining, that's largely in the competition with China, because they're getting decimated. So I don't want them doubling down on China. I don't want them doubling down just the way they did with Russia. But when it comes to a war, and we already have multiple wars going on, we are going to need it's not just be us that's manufacturing bullets and ammunition. We are going to need Europe. And the fact that China is undercutting them and putting these companies out of business. That's their intention. So you have to think this is very, very multifold. And one of these pieces is, the BBC asked me about China and said, "Oh, you're about energy security and the economy." Well, yes, no duh. I am about energy security and the economy. I care deeply about it. And so producing your own energy, refining your own energy, and having that and also exporting it, that's huge. But when it comes to China, it's multifaceted. It's that, they're not just exporting crappy wind and solar that they make from forced labor, that they make with cheap coal. That's one. They're crappy forms of energy. When we put them into our grid, they increase prices, they reduce reliability, and they're just not great forms of energy. I don't like that they're made in China with forced labor and without the rule of law and human dignity, and that they're made with coal-fired power plants that don't have the same emission standards as we do and cleaner. All of that's bad. I don't care about the CO2 emissions as much as I care about the fact that it's forced labor. That's wrong. And the fact that we're buying it and saying that we're solving energy security, we're not. We're actually hurting it. And that's something that didn't come across in BBC. They said, "Oh, well, the wind on the solar panels and the wind turbines are fine." Well, they're not, because they eventually do have to be replaced. And it's less about being tied with China for that. It's not like, "Oh, okay, we get rid of that." No, that's not the problem. That's not their end goal, is that we're just hooked on China for crappy wind turbines and solar panels. It's that they're selling this, they're dumping it into the market just like they're doing with EVs, and they're hurting manufacturing in the US and in Europe. They're hurting the ability, so they're putting people out of jobs, they're hurting manufacturing, and they're also an added benefit of hurting their grid. So the things that make America so great, the things that, if we think about the Cold War and we think about why we won the Cold War, and some of those things, if you look at government reports and stuff, it's really about, we had a superior economic model, right? We had a great economy and we had rule of law. Well, we have to think about the thing that make us different now, and is that we have energy. We have more energy than anyone in the entire world. And if we embrace that, prior to this administration, we did not have high electricity prices. And when you allow consumers to have low and stable electricity prices and access to energy, that fuels your entire economy. That helps you weather recessions. That helps you weather economic storms, because people can turn their lights on and affordably heat their homes, and it allows businesses and people to thrive. And so when we think about how, like, competition, it's for the consumer just being able to pay their electric bill. And two, it's the actual manufacturing. It's that if you want to enable manufacturing, as JD Vance says, that's what he's getting to, is that
Yep.
stop the forced labor, stop the bleeding, but also we got to make it here, because you don't, like, China is not your friend.
No,
Like, case
no,
in
and you're
point.
yeah, and you're spot on. I mean, we've got some reports, the American Energy Institute.com, talking about child labor in the EV marketplace. Over 70, I think it's 76% of the mines in the Congo are owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. UNICEF reports 40,000 children between the ages of 4 and 13 working in these mines. It
That's because
sounds
they're
fancy.
little and they call them
Yeah, yeah,
artisanal mines, where
artisanal.
the kids
Sounds
can
like
climb
fancy.
down and yeah,
Yeah, it's so
so
the
sad.
woke, white, self-righteous coastal elites can say, "Oh, my car was made with artisanal miners." I mean, it just sounds fancy while they're
Children.
drinking
So
their
it's really
wine. Yeah,
horrible.
those are small kids.
You can't even laugh. You can't even. It's not laughable. I mean, it's just
It's appalling.
it's really appalling.
I hope a new Congress has human rights tribunals and calls people that are pushing these policies and not allowing funds to flow into these countries like Ethiopia, South Africa, where Germany pays South Africa $800 million not to expand their coal-fired generation so that Germany can get credit for the decarbonization. It's absolutely absurd. They're crushing the people in South Africa with load shedding. If you don't know what load shedding is, people in South Africa experience it every day for 3 to 4 hours a day. It's rolling brownouts. It's what's coming to the United States. It's already happening in places
Yeah,
like
but in
California.
Africa, you have to realize, with massive corruption and leadership who didn't build a
That's
coal-fired
kind of
power.
part of the problem too. Yeah,
You
yeah,
so but there's two things I want to point out, and I will say this: I give credit where credit is due, and I criticize. And the Trump administration started the work on China. I have not heard a lot. I want a hawk. I want a China hawk in government. I would happily work for a Trump administration for on China and energy, and in how they are interwoven. But I want a China hawk, and that's because I just listened to this. I think it's China Unscripted. There's a lot of, like, I wouldn't even call them amateurs, but there's a lot of China amateur podcasts out that are great. And they have a woman who worked for Pompeo on there, and I haven't finished the podcast yet, but it was so great because she's just saying all the things I've been studying for years, which is that, like, SDG. So mentions SDG within the UN, and how she had to spend her time under Pompeo with, the reason that the Trump administration pulled out of some of these things, like the UN was pulling out of some of these things, because she said they couldn't influence it. That all these people had drank the China Kool-Aid, and the UN is saying sustainable development goals, SDG,
mhm.
which is the UN stuff, all the green stuff. They were saying that the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road, their BRI, which includes building coal-fired power plants and all kinds of stuff and cement and everything, that SDG, that it's got sustainable development goals, that it's basically the SDG and the Belt and Road are synonymous. And she's like, this is crazy. And the whole premise of the conversation is she was talking about how to label that they at the very end of the Trump administration, they did get through under Pompeo. They got through that labeling the Uyghur genocide in China as genocide and how hard that was. And it's such a great conversation to listen to because, that's why I take this seriously. And I'm not laughing at this. The fact that they're calling Trump Hitler and calling, Trump supporters garbage and calling, and you hear this fascist term all over. And yet we couldn't label what actually persecuting of a population of these Uyghurs that we had a hard time labeling as genocide. That's insane. So she said that there was a lot of legal implications for that. And so she gets through like how hard it was to actually deal with folks within the UN, to actually deal with Europeans. They had to drink all the Kool-Aid. And so you have to realize that the China problem is very, very multifaceted. It is very, very interwoven with energy and very, very interwoven with manufacturing. And we went longer on the podcast than I wanted to, but I cannot underscore enough how important energy and and whoever in like this election matters to manufacturing, and how I desperately want I want an initiative, and hopefully with American Energy Institute and others. I want natural gas to stand up. I want coal to stand up, and I want people to recognize that we got to stop getting coal out of the grid. We have to have stable, reliable baseload power. We need to enable natural gas. We got to stem the bleeding with this green stuff that's coming from China. But we have to get manufacturing to understand that they need reliable domestic energy to actually manufacture, to lower their cost of manufacturing so they can compete with China. Because the
Yep.
goal that China's having is they want to get rid of the competition. Because I've told listeners this before, I'm not being a World War III alarmist or anything, but China is gearing for competition. And so if they push comes to shove, they're going to do it. And so you have to realize that if Ford and Volkswagen are not out there, look, you just can study World War II and you can see where, it was domestic industry that was actually building the planes. So if they don't exist, then you don't have anyone building this. And I think the last point I want to say on China is that when you have 1/3 of the world's power generation, 1/3, folks, that is like basically 29,000 terawatt hours of power. China has basically 10,000 terawatt hours of that power. Over half of that is cold. And most of their, like, over 75% of the primary energy consumption is is electricity. They are in the game of building things. And we often talk about wars fought on oil and for oil. It's not about that. China's going to fight a war by building stuff. And so when they build stuff, and we need to really rethink how we're thinking about primary energy consumption and what we're doing. Because even in the developed world, even when you look at the primary energy consumption for Europe, there's still a large chunk that's oil, which means it's transportation, which means it's a normal economy. You don't have that so much in China. And I think we're really missing the ball here. And there's serious, serious ramifications within energy, within national security, within economic security, that I just can't underscore enough.
Yeah, I think on January 20th with a new administration, hopefully a new administration, that what you will see is you will see an immediate cutoff of oil from Iran to China.
Oh,
Five,
yes. Let's talk.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you and I wrote about this. $5 billion a month is flowing from China to Iran, funding wars with Hezbollah and then Hamas against Israel, our ally, our biggest ally in the Middle East. So almost immediately you would feel peace, and then you would start to punish those people that are terrorists, people like Iran that are now selling $1 billion worth of electricity to Iraq because of the cash flow that they have. So they're expanding their infrastructure. China's expanding its infrastructure, now exporting energy. This is something I learned from you. They're exporting energy for the
Yep.
first time in the form of diesel, jet fuel, and home heating oil, something that we desperately need. They're expanding the refining capacity, a lesson that we should be learning from. And as I've told many interviews, we need more natural gas, we need more coal, we need more nuclear, we need more affordable and reliable electricity. I've been harping on politicians, and I'm guilty of saying this, all of the above energy policy. We don't need an all of the above energy policy. We need an affordable and reliable energy policy. All of the above includes heavily subsidized Chinese made things that don't work when we need them, and they're leading to deindustrialization in Germany, the United Kingdom, California, and the United States. We need affordable and reliable, and we need an affordable and reliable energy policy, because those weather dependent unreliables are neither affordable nor are they reliable.
Absolutely. And I think if you're listening and you've got to this point, I want to hone in these three last things. That is that it's Iran, so it's foreign policy and energy, and that's not it hasn't been talked about at all, and it's critically important. So I do not. I mean, I truthfully believe this. I do not think Harris or a Harris team is qualified to deal with the foreign policy issues of the day. I don't think that there are no qualifications. I don't think she has an understanding of foreign policy. And I think that you have to have a really, really deep understanding of energy to deal with the foreign policy. So one of those biggest things is Iran. So we have Iran supporting all these proxies and these Iranian-backed groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, all these three H's. All those wars are ongoing, folks. We have three, Israel's fighting a three-front war. They're a very tiny country. They're 9 million people, and they're working their ass off just to not die. And so, we support them because of that, because they are democracy in the Middle East. And without Israel, you want to know what's going to, I mean, it would be hell in the Middle East. And it would be hell for us because hotbed of terrorism it doesn't stay in the Middle East long, folks. It comes to your doorstep eventually. You see that in Europe. But the Iran thing is really serious because you can see Iranian production. I've been charting this to show clients and talk about this, but this is one of the biggest implications for this election is you have to sanction Iran. We already have sanctions on Iran. You have to enforce them. So under the Trump administration, they sanctioned Iran, and there was a lot of curbs. Pulling out of the JCPOA, pulling out of these things were really smart. And you listen to a lot of people. If you're listening to a really good podcast, folks, you'll hear this: is that most people on the policy side really support this. The foreign policy work that Trump did, most people are advocates for the Abraham Accords. All these things are really big implications for Middle East, for foreign policy, and for energy. The implications for energy. So for Iran, you sanctioned this crude under the Trump administration. Production went down. It went down, and they were exporting a lot less crude. They weren't exporting this to China. You can do that when you're producing a lot of oil. We are producing a lot of oil. We have pretty low oil prices. We have Saudi Arabia sitting on the sidelines of producing just shy of 9 million barrels per day. They can easily jump up to 12 million barrels a day. Pretty sure you could get on the phone with the Saudis and say, hey, we're going to sanction Iran. We're going to cut that crude supply. So you're going to be able to increase output. They're not going to be heartbroken. It's not going to be a hard phone call to make. The fact that the Biden administration hasn't done it means that it's because they're so anti-oil. They're so inept on policymaking on energy. It is insane. And they've been very, not pro-Iran, but they wanted to cut a deal from day one with Iran. And so what they've done is they've allowed, Iran's now producing over 3 million barrels a day. They're sending 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day exclusively to China. So, I mean, just back of the envelope at oil price, it's at least $4 billion a month that China is sending to Iran. So they have all this money to splash around. So it doesn't matter the sanctions they're under. By the way, Iran is building out their capacity. And something that I think came out really clear within the Joe Rogan interview with Trump was talking about nuclear. And I say this because I don't think enough people I listen to Harris and I listen to Trump. I don't hear anything of substance coming out of Harris's mouth except laughing and making fun of Donald Trump. And what I hear from Donald Trump is getting nerdy on cement. Holy crap, he gets nerdy on cement on the Joe Rogan podcast, but he talks about nuclear and he says, CO2 emissions are not your big thing. It's nuclear. Nuclear power is huge. And you mentioned nuclear, and I'm not anti-nuclear by any means, but when he talks about nuclear, super serious in the Middle East when you have nuclear capacity. So Iran having nuclear capacity, there you see the hardliners, you see these entities that they've used it in. That's really big. And then Russia and Ukraine, it's an ongoing war. And so what you hear and on the Ukraine cast, what you heard from Bolton, who is very, very anti-Trump, but he's been really clear on what a Harris administration would mean on Ukraine. And he says, look, she doesn't want to change it. She just wants to continue this. It's just going to
Yeah.
keep on going. Well, that means a lot of people are going to die. And so when you actually listen to BBC, when they're in Ukraine, they ask people on the ground, hey, you're getting more money from America. What does that mean for you? And they say, quote, and it's on the BBC, they said, if the money goes where it needs, that's great. And I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that means that there's a recognition, like we have to make sure the money's going. I'm not saying we should not support Ukraine, but you can't just have an ongoing war forever because we're draining our ammunitions and it's really serious. And you have to be honest about where you're writing checks and how you're doing this. So the foreign policy implications with energy are massive. And so you also have implications that the fact that the Biden administration is still sanctioning Russia, that's ridiculous. We should have put every damn sanction on the planet on day one. The fact that you're 4 years in, you're still sanctioning means you didn't do enough. And by the way, they're getting crap tons of money because they're producing 11 million barrels a day of crude oil. They're exporting a ton of crude oil, and they're getting the gap on the spread, the Brent Russian spread has really narrowed. So they're getting $67, $68 a barrel for their exports. So Russia has all the money to fund this war, and they've just brought in 10,000 North Korean troops. So now we've got North Korea, we've got China, we've got Russia, and I just looked at the exports, China to Russia. China's really ramped up their exports of all the stuff they're exporting to Russia. So you have a massive foreign policy, encompassing and encapsulating energy that the next president's going to have to deal with. And this current administration hasn't been able to do it, hasn't been willing to do it. And so you're going to have, the Trump administration, if they are the administration, is really going to have to step up. And if you have a Harris administration, one, that they're not going to step up, and two, this could actually probably implode. So that's massively, massively critical. And lastly, is that I just can't underscore how important it is for to that on the foreign policy side and domestically electricity, and the fact that when JD Vance was talking about lowering energy costs, and I have clients asking me, what does that mean for oil and natural gas prices? That means that you probably are, I'm going to be honest, you're probably going to have low oil prices. When you say drill, baby, drill, and frack, 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 that means you're going to be allowed to drill and frack. That's great. That means
Yeah.
your business and your stock price and share price is probably going to go up. That means you're probably going to be able to build infrastructure. That means maybe lower oil prices. We saw that under Trump. However, that means you're going to be able to build stuff. And that probably could mean a little bit higher natural gas prices, or maybe more stable, because if I am stopping killing coal out of the grid, I can keep that stable coal, and I can offset the spikes I have in natural gas with that baseload coal. That's hugely beneficial for consumers and for manufacturing and for everyone, and the oil and gas industry who needs power. So if I do that, and if I stem the bleeding from, if I'm Vance or if I'm Trump and I'm talking about energy, and I say we are going to take the tailwinds away from the CO2, and we're going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. We are going to allow natural gas and coal to be a part of our grid, and we are going to take inflation away from the consumer, and we're going to make electricity. We're going to make utility companies pass along savings of natural gas to the consumer. That goes a long, long way in reducing inflation. So whether or not they can do that, utilities are regulated, but I think there's a lot of things on utilities they could do. But I think those are the two biggest things that I think people really need to pay attention to, into real, real outcomes of what this means for oil and gas. And obviously,
Yeah.
prices matter a great deal in terms of, if we export more gas, prices can go up a little bit. If we consume more gas, the same thing.
I think we really need to go after utilities and their political agendas that they're
Oh boy,
embracing.
do we
You
ever.
look in Texas where we had issues with CenterPoint in February, people without electricity for weeks. And you look at CenterPoint, you look at every investor-owned utility that operates in the state of Texas, and if I'd have to guess, this is the case in the United States. They've all embraced political agendas: decarbonization, net zero, Paris Accord. Those aren't the law of the land in the United States. They're embracing ESG and DEI, which I think is interesting because there's a Russian dark fleet tanker moving oil. It's called Ceres, and I'm just like, it's CERES, which is the name of a nonprofit in Boston, which is really the mother of ESG. They
Hmm.
created, and they partnered with other groups to create the Climate Action 100 Plus. I mean, this is it cracks me up because I'm a policy wonk and nerd, and do research and publish research on these groups that are pushing this agenda, that are pushing this narrative. They've been extremely successful with getting companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the big three financial investors that in Texas own at least 20% of every single investor-owned utility, to push these political agendas within their boards. And I think they need to reject them. And I think these regulated utilities should be held accountable. They shouldn't be able to operate in states with these agendas. In Texas, I had the opportunity in 2020 to write a bill that said if you boycott fossil fuels, you can't do business with the state of Texas. I got to define what boycott meant. And that put companies like BlackRock on our boycott list. I mean, they've been divested nearly $10 billion of Texas tax dollars and pension funds because they're using those dollars and weaponizing them against responsible American energy producers. But I think if you have a Trump administration starting on January 20th, 2025, then you're going to see signals to the market that maybe it's okay to invest in oil and gas. But you look between 2015 and 2022, there was a 92% reduction in private capital raised to invest in oil and gas. A 92% reduction because they're
And
being
that's why
told,
profit, and when margins and profits and returns were going up. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
there's never been a better time to invest in oil and gas. So if I don't go work for if I don't run for office or work for a Trump administration, I am going to go buy some wells. Damn it. I'm going to go buy some production, because like, if you're thinking about it, but you're absolutely right. You've had a massive, this is where I say the divestment and the headwinds and tailwinds so meaningful, because if you have a Trump administration, the tailwinds come back for, the headwinds go away for oil and gas, and you have some tailwinds. And so just the ability, the okay to invest. And you probably are going to see the US be a bit of an island in the West, where you're going to have oil and gas stocks probably perform. People will be able to invest, and you're not going to feel the constraint. These companies aren't going to feel as pressured to be spending on things that don't make money, like wind and solar at Exxon. They're not, they shouldn't be, they're going to, that pressure is going to be gone, especially if we pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. That's really good for business folks. It's really, really, really good for your electric bills. But the utilities are, oh man. I mean, I could just live on soup and probably just go after utilities and be a very happy woman, because I could be poor, and if I could make a difference there, I would probably be really, really happy, because what Excel has done in Colorado and what I've seen in my utility bill, and the ability for people to pay their utilities is amazing. And listening to their earnings calls and hearing them say what they say, where they barely talk about reliability and they talk about clean, clean, clean. And they've
Hmm.
shoved, if you look at the grid of Colorado, it's complete crap. There's so much wind into the grid. They've decommissioned coal. And so the costs were already bearing it. But that's like, we, you cannot overemphasize that enough, is that, going after utility companies. And for Colorado, I've said this before, but I've heard out of state legislators tell me that the Colorado Public Utilities Commission is a rubber stamp for Excel's rate increases. And
Yep.
so there is an entity apparently within the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, and I welcome them to come on the podcast. I'm happy to talk to the PUC of talking about this, of because there's an entity that advocates for the consumers. Where are they? Where's their stamp on their website? How do people get a hold of them? And how can I talk to them about my energy bills and what it matters? And how can we get the consumer to be heard? And that means the consumer being heard. And I'm be clear, folks, it means stopping pulling out coal out of your baseload power and adding more natural gas and stopping the wind and solar additions. That's the only way you're going to stem this. You just have to do that. And by the way, your impact in global CO2 emissions and even US CO2 emissions is all for naught, because China is at 13,000 million tons of CO2 emissions and rising, and we are declining. We're at 1990 levels. We're about 5,000 and change CO2 emissions. So that's it. Like that's where we're at for the numbers. And so every coal-fired power plant you decommission in the U.S., particularly in Colorado, you're just adding in China. It's
That's
just
it. Yeah.
whack-a-mole. It's not doing a damn thing. And as we pointed out, it's just hurting jobs, the cost of energy and manufacturing, and it's just destabilizing and hurting the competitiveness of the U.S.
Yeah, these energy transition agendas are anti-American at the very root. But you're right about expensive energy. Like, I've got a board member who's building a house in Colorado, and he called me furious. He's like, "Do you realize what?" He's like, "I'm building a house out in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. Do you realize what I'm required to add to my new construction?" I said, "Yes, I'm aware." And he's like, "Are you kidding me?" He goes, "I either have to pay a massive fee, or I have to put in an electric vehicle charging the wiring for it." And then I said, "Yeah, then your utility will give you a rebate about $500 for the electric vehicle charger if you put it to your home." And then they socialize those costs and rate increases to everybody that lives around him in an existing home. So not only is it increasing the cost of new homes, it's increasing the cost of existing homes
Well, they
because
certainly haven't, they certainly haven't subsidized my utilities. I mean, and I have my natural gas fireplace running. I mean, yeah, it's I can't tell you how many stories like that I hear. But I will say, before we close this, I want to give a shout out to. This is a political podcast. So if you were not interested in listening to politics, then you shouldn't have been listening to this podcast, because we have an election coming up. But my clients know this, is that if you ask my opinion on politics, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to put it into a framework that matters to your business. But really, this is about, was ripping through slides, literally charting the decommissioning of coal against electricity prices from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, looking at this, seeing what is the rise. And it's clear that it's decommissioning coal and it's adding the wind and solar. It's not just adding wind and solar. And then you have this price variability with natural gas. So I care about the data a lot. So, supporting me, supporting my business, allowing this podcast to get out there, that's huge. And then the same thing, I'm working with Jason. I'm the economist for American Energy Institute. We want to do more. Really want to do more. Talk to board members. Do this. And actually do more. And it's not just about being, yeah, yeah, raw, raw, drill, baby, drill. It is about getting this information out there and actually making a difference and making sure people can, to your point of what Chris Wright always says, human flourishing, and bettering of human lives. That's what this is about. And this is putting some, rational thinking on energy.
Yeah, amen. We've actually seen an incredible improvement in life expectancy, people moving out of extreme poverty over the last 50 years. And unfortunately, during the last 3 years, the numbers have gotten worse. But energy is the answer to ending poverty around the planet. And we produce that energy more responsibly than anywhere else on the planet. Right here in the United States, we should be producing more of it. You're right. We should be building things, building infrastructure to get that energy to market. So yes, while energy prices may go down during a Trump administration, that'll be great for the consumers. They will spend more money. That'll be great for the economy. And then we'll be able to get more energy to market, which will be great for everybody else on the face of the earth, so that they too can flourish and get to experience clean air and clean water.
Yeah, and it'd be awesome is if on the utility side is if the consumer, just like oil, when oil prices go up and you feel it you go to the gas station and you see oil prices go up, but when oil prices go down, you see that deflation and you see your gas prices your gasoline prices go down, your dollars per gallon go down. You know what you don't see? You don't see your natural gas prices have been $1 to $2. I tell you Henry Hub every day. Do you know what you're charged at as a residential gas prices? $23 an MCF right now. That means call up your representative, tell them to put Excel's
Right.
feet to the fire and say that is insane. So if we pass along that some of that savings, if the utility companies pass along the savings to consumer, that is how you save energy. That is how you lift up America. That is how you reduce costs and reduce inflation. And you can actually see, so you can not hurt the natural gas industry and lower prices for consumer. And you can lower oil prices. And I say this to oil industry. Last thing, it doesn't hurt the oil and gas industry to have lower and stable oil prices. Having the global economy is not healthy enough right now to take 80, 90, $100 oil. It's not healthy enough. And really it hurts the ability for the economy to thrive under high oil prices. So if you have 60, $70 oil, you're still making good returns, and that's a sweet spot you want to live in. But that's really, really healthy for the U.S. consumer, and we can produce it. And we're producing over 13 million barrels per day. I mean, it's a really, really good message. And that's the last thing I'll say is the industry get on board. Talk to Jason, talk to myself, but like no one is going to advocate for you except for yourselves. So,
That's right. Quit feeding the crocodiles.
exactly, stop feeding the crocodiles.
Yeah,
Um,
because
but
you'll
with that,
ultimately you're gonna get ingested. You'll get eaten, and it's just not a pretty thing. Fight for the industry. It's one of the reasons I brought you on board because you're a great voice for America, and that's I love what Chris Wright said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit. Energy isn't part of the economy;
it is the
it's the
economy.
heart.
Yep.
It's the heart of the economy. We don't have an economy without it. It's our lifeblood. We have to have it. Other people deserve it, and we need policymakers to hear from us rather than the grifters that have their hands out that want tax rates and different subsidies and rebates and that are concerned about decarbonization. Those are political agendas, a leftist agendas. So if you want to support our work, support Trisha. We need, if you've got policymakers that you think that we should be visiting with, or you're willing to help us set those meetings up, please let us know, because we just want to get out there and educate the general public. But more importantly, we want to educate policymakers and get them out of the way so that we can get to free markets and really to the benefit of American energy into America.
Yep. Well, that's awesome. I think that's a great way to close. And yes, there's a lot more we could talk about, which I will on future podcasts. But thank you so much, Jason. That was a fun flipperoo. And we'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Trisha. Appreciate it.
All right. Talk soon, folks. Bye.